I'd like to begin my panel. I'd love for all of you to introduce yourselves briefly. Tell us a bit about your role and also tell us a bit about your organization's climate strategies and how do PPAs fit into that overall sustainability strategy. Ilkem.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Ilkem. I sit in our London office. I look after global procurement of energy, utilities, and decarbonisation technologies for Unilever. We have very ambitious targets. For our scope 1 and 2, we have like 4 years, 10 months, a few hours to be net zero by 2030. And for our whole supply chain, 2039. For us, obviously, PPAs are big enablers to achieve our targets. Not to ourselves, because we figured that we are part of a bigger supply chain. All of our business partners are in this. So that is why in Unilever, sustainability and procurement are the same organization. So we are doing this with our partners. So scope 3 is a big part of my week-to-week, day-to-day agenda as well.
Interesting. Ulrika?
Hello. Thank you for being here. Ulrika Leverenz is my name. I'm heading the green investment function at H&M Group. And this function's responsibility is to deliver a strategy, a finance and investment strategy that enables the group to reach the sustainability targets. And as we have plenty of those, but I would say the two most important go in line with what you are saying. At H&M, we want to reach net zero through all scopes 1, 2, and 3 in 2040. And we have a 2030 target to reduce our emissions with 56% compared to baseline of 2019 and 2030. And for sure, to do so, the energy transition or transition to renewables, it's the main focus. And again, in doing so, PPA agreements is a very good tool to reach those targets.
Perfect. Zephyr.
Hey everyone, Zephyr Taylor from Mars Incorporated, and I look after our global sourcing of renewable energy. Similarly to two other co-panelists here, we have a 2040 100% target for scope 1 and 2 and a 2050 net zero commitment. And PPAs are one of the principal tools in the corporate renewable sourcing tool belt, I would say, to hit that target. And so we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about those today.
Absolutely. Thank you for those introductions. So we're going to spend bulk of the panel trying to understand how these agreements are framed, how different organizations have tackled challenges and also developed some learnings and are going about with best practices. So first, Ulrika, I'd like to begin with you. If we could explore a bit on how H&M looks at tackling its scope 1 and 2 emissions and the approach that you have for scope 3 emissions. You said it's a very different way of thinking. It's a challenge, but you've kind of figured your way around it.
So for our own operations, which is then the scope 1 and 2, and if you look at what would it be at H&M, that's our stores, the electricity demand at our stores, and obviously distribution centers. For them, we have PPA agreements. We now have closed PPA agreements they're up and running for Spain, UK, and the US. And we have a new park developed that will be online 25, and Poland will be online in 26. So being the nature of the business of a company or fashion brand or retailer as H&M is that the electricity consumption is very widespread. We are present in very many markets and over thousands of stores. So that means that we close so-called virtual PPA agreements. And to explain shortly what that means, and the difference is that while in a but in the classic PPA, you also use the electricity that you purchase. Whereas in the VPPA, the electricity is sold on your behalf, but you receive the certificates or the ACs for this. And then you could ask, why then not just purchase certificates? Because that might be easier. There's a very big difference. For us, the additionality is important. We would like to be able to actually make sure that we increase the renewable electricity into the grid, and that you do with a PPA agreement. A second reason is that you have a possibility to secure a more stable pricing with a PPA agreement. So that is then the solution for scope 1 and 2. And then you quite rightly said, but what about scope 3? And maybe we have a different situation here. We talked in the beginning, I have a feeling for us, and for those that also listened to Adidas earlier today, scope 3 is the main emissions for fashion retail. About 99% is actually right now scope 3. If we wouldn't have had the PPAs for own operation, it would have been about 92%. But the main is scope 3, which means these emissions occur in the supply chain at our suppliers, where a big share of these suppliers are in the so-called emerging markets. Now, to decarbonize here, we need to electrify. But there's no use to electrify if there is no renewable electricity there. And here we see two hurdles. One is the policies and regulation, a regulatory hurdle, and the other one is the case of the fragmented supply chain. Just to quickly state what I mean with that. The first, when it comes to the regulatory, the emerging markets quite often are very heavily regulated when it comes to electricity market, meaning private-to-private agreements are very limited. And thus, an agreement as the corporate PPA is not really possible. Now, that means that if that is not possible, what would that mean? That means that the motivation for foreign investment might be less, because the corporate purchase power agreement gives the developer a security, a long-term security of an income, because they secure the sales for a longer term. With the security, the project becomes bankable. So an investor is more likely to invest in such a company. So thus, in the end, the lack of CPPA agreements or possibility might lead to that there is not enough willing investors, and therefore you have the lack of renewable electricity.
Sure. Ilkem, I imagine you have similar issues when it comes to thinking about how you do things differently in emerging markets. And I know you've talked a bit about earlier when we were talking about how you're thinking about it in terms of your supply chain vendors. So how is Unilever tackling this?
Yeah, pretty like Ulrika, she's put it nicely as well. So our supply chain is really big part of our emissions as well, and big part of emissions in emerging countries, where there might be a lack of infrastructure, there might be a lack of legislation environment, there might be lack of even the stability, economic stability and political stability as well. So what we are doing is we are trying to invite our partners, like in India is a very good example. When we are planning a PPA, we are looking at our suppliers as well. What is the load, what is their proximity, where they are located in, and can we include them to our PPAs, which we have publicly announced one in India going live this year. So 10 of our business partners are coming together under this umbrella PPA, which is going to help scope 2 and scope 3 as well for us. But obviously for themselves, scope 2 is a big part of their portfolio. So they might not have the financial means to put a financial security behind, but Unilever is granting that security, giving confidence to the investors to invest in it, and on the long run, covering them under our umbrella as well. Some of the emerging countries are more direct PPAs are possible, because like virtual or financial, we are talking them in Europe and some developed countries. But in emerging countries, it's mainly about the physical PPA, the physical delivery as well, wherever the legislation, local legislation allows, obviously. So it goes directly to the heart of Unilever's and our suppliers' supply chain, agreeing from the developers, using the transmission network, and physically getting the electricity as well.
So we'll That's interesting. We'll talk a bit about your ask from regulators, because I think it's always good to, when you're pointing out the challenges, but also think about what the solutions that industry has. We'll come to that in a bit. But Zephyr, I wanted to touch upon some of the challenges that we discussed when we were talking earlier. And we said, there's obviously what you do externally, but even internally, as organizations were thinking about PPAs, how do you convince multiple stakeholders? How do you account for it? So what has been your experience, and what's the playbook that you follow at Mars now?
I wish I had a perfect playbook that I followed all the time. It seems to vary case by case. A lot of the things that we've talked about, Ulrika talked about earlier, in terms of long-term supply security, price risk management, supplier relationships, the PPA model sells easily internally, particularly if you have an organization that fully understands and appreciates the value that this long-term agreement can offer versus a shorter-term, normal commodity market-esque sort of approach. So I think once you can familiarize your internal stakeholders with the fundamentals of the PPA instrument, then it makes the follow-along process of all the specifics and the nuances, and particularly getting a 75 to 100 page long contract worked through all your internal systems, that becomes easier. Now, with that said, there are nonetheless quite a number of challenges in terms of accounting treatment, obviously getting your legal teams aligned, and getting the businesses that are ultimately the customers or paying for these agreements to appreciate what that looks like across all of their contractual obligations. But nonetheless, I feel like the PPA model is quite well developed and mature enough at this point to where it's not necessarily groundbreaking, and it's not the vanguard financial and commercial instrument that it used to be when PPAs were first being piloted by large corporate buyers.
Interesting. Ulrika, you come from a financial background who's now looking at heading green investments at H&M. What are some of the conversations that you've had internally with different departments? How have you managed to get everyone aligned?
Yeah, exactly. I would like to say educate, involve, and be patient. So these are complex agreements still, many pages to read, and they take time. We have had processes that took 12 to 18 months. And during that time, many things can change. Pricing changes, legislation changes, maybe the ability or how much risk do you want to take on different partners, etc., etc. And in doing so, it's very important of our learning that you involve as many internal stakeholders as possible in the beginning, not just the CDB team or procurement team, but from facility and also, as you said, from accounting. How is it bookable? How do I see this in the books? How will I account for this? That has been the main questions that have occurred internally. So what I would say as a learning and a tip is, as I said, involve as many as possible, and to try to have a tight as a cross-functional team or a steering group that meets for all milestone decisions and are aware on the way what's happening in the process.
That's helpful. I'm sure if you meet Ulrika outside, she can give you a bit more detailed playbook. I know we've discussed it at length before, so just a pro tip. Ilkem, now I'd like to come to you to understand, we're reading about these different PPA models. So I cover tech companies, and it's a very simple virtual PPA, and that's all I knew about initially. But turns out it's a bit more complex than that. You have different models where corporates are looking at shorter durations, they're looking at aggregation models, hybrid agreements. Could you simplify some of those for us and give us a sense of what's popular in the market today?
Sure. Yeah. No, it was funny that you said virtual PPAs are simple, because many accountants will disagree with you. But you're right. There are different methods, and in different geographies, we need to tailor cut it for the different requirements for our supply chain over there. One of the things that you mentioned is short-term PPAs, which usually, when we say a corporate PPA, it's usually for longer years. It's 8 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20. hybrid. In your case, with tech giants, 25 years. So in some cases, depending on country's political stability or the currency situation, it can be on a shorter term. I have a good example about this, which may or may not be Argentina. So the country with a high political risk, the investments are not taking this. The only developments that you can find is local. And they want to take the development off the ground. So in that case, we go for a shorter duration, which is like in the vicinity of 3 to 4 years, to take the development off the ground, initiate it, kickstart it, and make it additional, like Ulrika said. This is one of the biggest corporations' contribution to renewable grids, with an option to extend it in the future for 10 years or 15 years, whenever there is a political stability that we have seen. There are other technologies, for example, like geothermal in South Asia. We are using geothermal renewable electricity, which very well depends on the well situation, the outcome of the steam coming from the depth of the earth. So then, again, the developer themselves have not a visibility for the next 15 years in the future. That well may be depleted by then. So we are going for short duration, but keeping an option behind that agreement that we can extend it further in the future. And there are other cases like hybrid, like you said. Only solar PPAs will never be able to help a factory during the night shifts or when the sun is not shining. So then it comes with a portfolio that we really appreciate if the utility is big enough to provide a hybrid solution of wind, solar, and storage, or wind or solar is enough in some cases, covering 90% of our consumption, which is what we are looking for, really.
Interesting. So, shorter agreements, hybrid agreements, and a couple of other options that are coming into the market, making PPAs hopefully not so complex, and also for not just large organizations, but also small to medium enterprises if they want to test it out. Interesting. So before I come to the audience for questions, and I'd urge you to prepare some of those while we have the last round, I want each of you to tell me briefly, if there was one or two regulatory asks that you had, what would those be? These could be based on best practices that you've witnessed in different regions, or any challenges that you're facing and you're seeking help or assistance from the governments. Zephyr, if we could begin with you.
I can only have two. Well, since we're on the topic of PPAs, first and foremost, the ability to do a bilateral transaction directly between a renewable energy project developer, IPP or otherwise, and a corporate buyer in this context. And I think that is a critical component of the enabling environment that you see absent from many of the emerging markets where we're looking to have the PPA model develop and be replicated. That's number one. Number two is having a financial version of the PPA. So not just the ability to bilaterally transact, but having that virtual PPA, that CFD settlement be an option. And surprisingly, there are many markets where a physical PPA is available, but a virtual PPA is not. And when you have decentralized load, and you want the relative simplicity, though I agree no PPA is simple, the virtual PPA model specifically as a subset of the PPA umbrella is quite effective and efficient at achieving and securing your renewable energy coverage and being able to allocate that coverage across a decentralized set of load centers.
Thank you. Ulrika?
+1 on that. I would like to add something for all us, but exactly what you are saying. I would like to add something on that. For all parts of the industry, as the textile industry, that has a very fragmented supply chain, which means that we share supplier with all other brands. I would have an extra wish for a sort of VPPA or financial PPA that could work in a collaborative sense, because for any individual brand that would like to invest and support a PPA or equity investment or an undertaking agreement or anything in that sense, they cannot do so only for their share, because the supplier obviously needs to cover the full volume of the demand. And in that sense, the supplier would then have reduce their scope 1 and 2, and then the brand will reduce their scope 3. But it would be great if there is some sort of agreement or as an incentive that with this investment or the financial support that the brands can do for the supply chain, for the PPAs, they could also actually be able to do that for their share and receive the ESCs, whereas the supplier will receive their green electricity. And that would be my ask.
Interesting. Ilkem?
So the message, I would say, would be really changing from geography to geography, right? If I had to start from the UK, I would probably say stick with Europe. You are just in the biggest neighborhood is your Europe, so more connection points, like the national grid highlighted this morning. Join the AIB. Don't try to detach yourself from the European grid, which is going to be very useful in the future for renewable energy deployment, all the trading, etc. If I had to reach out to some South Mediterranean governments, I would possibly say just empty your queue in permitting. Release them all or fast track them, find a way to increase the renewable deployment in southern countries. If I had to go for like the ones in Turkey, South Africa, provide some political stability for the future, enable the market for private PPAs to be developed between the independent buyers and independent sellers. If I had to go for like Indonesia, Vietnam, I would say just open the market, liberate it to the energy, let the corporates, let the private individuals and companies do their best. If I had to say, probably in US, I would say do not break what has already been done. So don't damage it, like the Hippocrates oath. I'd probably say that.
So that's an interesting takeaway, and I think this is something we discussed when we began talking about this panel. Is you're going to still have different approaches across different geographies and across countries with different political stability risks and economic risks. So that's a very major takeaway for me at the end of this. And we have a couple of minutes if there are any questions in the audience. Yes, lady ahead.
Hi, my name is Alexandra. I work with Schneider Electric Sustainability Business, and we're an advisor on corporate PPAs and other renewable energy solutions. I have a specific question around something that was mentioned, and I think, Ulrika, you were the one who talked about it in terms of, I guess, the role of your companies in terms of engaging with your suppliers. So Schneider Electric also run supply chain renewables initiatives for 36 different companies. We have over 2,500 suppliers within the network.
Yeah.
And often, as you've mentioned, a lot of those supply chains are in markets where it's very difficult to access renewable energy. And the sponsor companies are like, well, we need to make progress in South Korea, you know. So Schneider, you know, come up with some cohort PPAs and work with those suppliers.
Yes.
Which is very challenging because not only are PPAs still very complicated contracts, you're also dealing with companies that are less advanced and in markets where there's much more risk and it's much more difficult to do these contracts. So I guess the question is, what other roles do you see companies playing in terms of working with their suppliers and engaging their suppliers and maybe thinking of alternative solutions when, when something like a PPA doesn't exist in a market yet?
Many, but generally a commitment to, and this is what I mean with the fragmentation, that even if one of the brands or the customer of that supplier is on board, it's important for the supplier to know that the rest of his customer also are on board. So there's a commitment from the brands that they want the change, and that's where we do need some sort of collaborative finance tool or in that sense, which maybe could be formed by a company like yours, where brands can tap in that sense. But the commitment could be both administrative, to try to organize those cohorts and say, we have this amount of suppliers. If you talk to them, that if you go together, we can secure a PPA that is actually cut to the volume that you need, because that's also the issue that quite often the minimum volume for such a PPA is quite high, and a separate individual supplier will not be able to take up that volume. He needs other, and someone needs to organize that. So that the brand could do to organize. They could also go in with undertaking agreements, I would say, or a sort of undertaking guarantees that what happens if the supplier falls out, then the PPA provider will stand without. But then the brand can give a guarantee for that. That's also possible. So that are two things that you could do.
Brilliant. We have one more question. The gentleman right there who raised. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Good afternoon. Great conversation. Nikhil Chogle. I'm a partner in a private equity firm looking at micro hydro, looking at all the good stuff. So I have a question first for Zephyr. Is it possible to have a virtual PPA that is tradable across borders where there's no physical grid connectivity? And the second question is, a lot of infrastructure projects are long duration, right? They're not really 3 to 5 years. So what is the overall consensus in terms of declining energy prices versus term of the PPAs? I mean, this is a fundamental financing question because at the moment, because it's not a corporate AA rated PPA, the prices of debt are pretty high, and that affects the investability of hydropower projects at least. So grateful for your views.
I'll try to hit both of those. Whether or not virtual PPAs are tradable is, well, it's the prerogative and at the discretion of the companies who are executing them, as well as the third-party entities, if you will, that are facilitating the transfer of those EACs. So if you take the European model, the AIB is one of the principal entities that determine the cross-border tradability of the guarantees of origin themselves. And then another example of a third party that governs that ability to transfer between countries is RE100. So if you're a corporate buyer who follows the RE100 model, for example, then it is allowable. So there are a few different factors that play into transferability across borders for the virtual PPA model, with some degree, albeit it's on a spectrum, of physical transferability of energy corresponding to that. The second question, well, first and foremost, I'd say declining energy prices in the long term is very market specific and TBD. Though if you know exactly where energy prices are going, I'd love to talk to you later.
If you guarantee.
One of the biggest questions that we all want an answer to. But I think that varies significantly depending on which market you're operating in. And to the extent that informs and influences both the willingness to pursue and execute PPAs from the buy side, as well as the project development and financing from the sell side, it's connected, but not as strongly, I would proffer, as one might think. I think you have to make decisions now that will have impacts into the future that are not perfectly foreseeable. And you can never know exactly what will happen with both energy prices, technology, solution availability. So to some extent, all companies are taking risks, not just in the world of renewables, but across many different sectors and industries. And this is no different. And where energy prices go, you can look historically at different markets where PPAs have been executed, and you're going to see a myriad of outcomes. And by consequence, the relative merit or demerit of those agreements that were executed years previously.
Brilliant. So unless someone can come up with a formula to predict energy prices, I think we will keep having this conversation. Well, I know we had a couple more questions, but unfortunately, we're going to have to end this right here. Feel free to grab our speakers in the lounge and in the networking session a couple of hours from now after 4 p.m. Thank you very much for joining us for the panel, and thank you for joining us for this session.
Thank you.